Hi there, this is Solitary Ronan from Solitary Ronan Films, and welcome to another random review. Today's random review is Deep End from 1970, directed by Jerzy Skolimoski, the Polish exile, starring Jane Asher and John Mulder Brown, and a host of German actors. This is a really odd, excellent film. It's set in London at the end of the swinging 60s, even though most of it was shot in Munich. It's written by a couple of Poles. It really has an odd feeling to it. It kind of reminds me of No Orchids for Miss Blandish, which was an American film noir, but it was written by an Englishman who had never been to America, and it was an all English cast, so it was just this weird idea of what an American noir would be. And this film has the same kind of feel. It's set in London, even though most of it wasn't shot in London, written by Poles, made in Germany. This BFI Blu-ray DVD combo release is excellent. It's in their Flipside series number 19, and this has a wonderful booklet, and the extras are just fantastic. There's a 74-minute making of documentary from 2011, which is just wonderful. There's 12 minutes not of deleted scenes, because those deleted scenes are gone, but just talking about the deleted scenes. And there's a trailer, and there's also a 10-minute short film by Francine Winham from 1976 called Careless Love, starring Jane Asher, who is a single mother, which in the 70s was obviously more of a stigma about, and her current boyfriend, and she asks him whether she get married, and of course he just is not interested in marriage, so she takes drastic steps to hopefully marry him, which is an interesting little film. So it's a wealth of extras. I would highly recommend picking up, because the film itself is fantastic. Jane Asher, growing up in the 80s, the late 70s, 80s, Jane Asher was on British television. She was doing kind of cookery programmes and things like that, and you always had this image of her being prim and proper. But obviously, if you look at her early career, I mean, she was in The Mask of the Red Death when she was 17. She's 23 in The Deep End. She's almost a kind of a little bit of how we think of Helen Mirren now, perhaps, as far as kind of establishment, or a bit, whereas Helen Mirren in her early days was a bit of a hellraiser. She did challenging work when she was younger, and obviously she taught Liam Neeson lots of things on the set of Excalibur, apparently. So growing up, Jane Asher was kind of that kind of establishment figure and kind of safe, whereas if you actually look at her early work, she did a lot of interesting films. She was naked in quite a lot of them, and she gets naked in this one as well. This is a story of Mike, who is a 15-year-old boy who has just left school, and he's starting a job in public baths. And Jane Asher plays Susan, who's a bit older, a bit more experienced in many ways. And she is the female attendant in the baths. The baths are really kind of run down, and dingy, very colourful and interesting though. The art director was Tony Pratt, who's a fairly famous art director, and he's the nephew of William Henry Pratt, or as he is more famously known, Boris Karloff. There's a nice bit in the extras where Tony Pratt shows off a signed photo by Boris Karloff that he sent to his nephew. And it's interesting because, again, in that wonderful documentary, Tony Pratt talks about Jacques Demy's Umbrellas of Cherbourg being an influence on the colour palette of Deep End, because there's lots of wonderful reds. I mean, red is a recurrent theme throughout the film, and there's a wonderful kind of bit of a brightly painted yellow wall that features later in the film. So you can kind of see that influence on Umbrellas of Cherbourg, or vice versa. And also, I mean, this was 1970, but obviously Argento was just beginning in the early 70s. And you can probably see that Umbrellas of Cherbourg was an influence on Argento as well, because these films are so colourful. And the Deep End is certainly that. It starts with red, and like I said, it's a recurrent theme. Again, I'm not going to go into spoilers. I mean, this film is really quite erotic, and you can tell that it wasn't made by a British filmmaker. You can tell it would have to be a foreigner, just because it just has this odd feel. It is very subversive and transgressive. It's talking about, obviously, sexuality. We're dealing with a 15-year-old boy here. So Jane Asher tells Mike that, you know, some of the ladies and perhaps some of the men might tip you a little bit extra for certain things that they might like. And one of the clientele is Diana Dors, who, of course, at this point in 1970, her struggles with alcoholism were fairly famous. This is like 15, 20 years past her peak of her career, and she plays a woman who takes a shine to Mike and pretty much molests him while talking about football and George Best. She gets quite excited about football. You know, Jerzy Skolimoski talks about in the extras that was the only way to get that scene through the censors, was to pretty much have her talk about football and not other things. I mean, she's talking about balls gliding past goals and into a bulging net, and she practically molests Mike, but gives him a good tip. So you have all of that. You have the tension between Mike and Susan. Susan is engaged to not particularly a nice man. She's also seeing a local PE teacher who comes to the baths with his class of schoolgirls, and again, he's a little bit inappropriate with them. Again, it's probably a film you just couldn't make nowadays, or have certain things in it that were able to be seen in 1970 that perhaps you couldn't get away with in 2021. So she's seeing two men who in different ways are kind of controlling, but then she's very controlling as far as Mike is concerned, because she can see that he's obviously likes her and he's not experienced in the ways of women. So she kind of teases him and then pushes him away, and teases him and pushes him away. You know how this is going to end. It's going to end with sexual obsession. He follows her to a cinema where her boyfriend, very much like Travis Bickle, has taken her to a sex film, The Science of Sex, which again was just an invented film shot by Slimovsky, who just wanted to take the mickey out of those kind of porno films that were passing off at the time as pseudo-scientific films, but it was just an excuse to show sex. And then Mike is feeling her up, essentially, and she wants the manager and the police, but then she actually turns around and starts kissing him while her boyfriend's away. But because the couple leave the club, he can't get charged with anything, and then it turns out that he's actually only 15, so the police want to actually charge the cinema for letting him in the first place. So again, there's an attraction and rejection by Susan towards Mike throughout the film. He ends up essentially turning into a stalker and following her through the streets. Again, there's a wonderful scene in Soho where they go into a couples club, and obviously Mike can't get in, so he paces up and down outside, and this is the brilliant yellow wall, which is just stunning, this corner. And somebody's selling hot dogs, and who would you think sells hot dogs in Soho? It's Burke Walk, who, this was before the Pink Panther, 1970, or just after the Pink Panther. I can't actually remember when the Pink Panther was. I'm not a huge Pink Panther fan, but he sells hot dogs, and during the space of the scene, Mike buys probably about half a dozen hot dogs, and every time Burke Walk asks with mustard, and then they get into bowing. It's actually quite wonderful to see Burke Walk selling hot dogs. And outside one of the Soho clubs, there's a cutout of what looks like Susan topless, and Mike proceeds to steal that and follow her onto the subway with it. Now, it's interesting because whether it is actually a kind of poster cutout of Susan or whether that's just in his mind, she doesn't confirm or deny it, and he doesn't say it's definitely you or is it you, so we do kind of get the feeling that it's perhaps in his mind it's maybe just a woman who looks like Susan, and he has a kind of breakdown in the subway as he's desperate for her to tell him whether it's her or not. So again, the obsession just increases, and he is causing friction with both of her relationships. She has her fiance who's bought her a diamond ring, and then there's a scene where Mike has damaged her car, the teacher's car, and she loses the ring by punching Mike in the snow, and of course you lose a diamond in the snow. It's not very easy to find. There's actually a wonderful scene before that where she calls over a spaniel, and when he comes over she throws a snowball at it. So again, it's just a little character beat into showing her, she'll bring things in, but then she just wants to play with them and toy with them and reject them. So they have this scheme where they're going to pick up all the snow, put it into bags, take it back to the swimming pool, to the water, to the baths, and melt it to try and find the diamond. I won't tell you whether they find the diamond, and I'm going to stop there as far as the plot's concerned. You're going to have to go and watch it yourself. I think you can actually pick up this release pretty cheaply, in actual fact. I'm sure I only picked up for like £6 or £7 maybe, but certainly well worth picking up because, like I say, it's got a feature-length documentary and obviously the film. Most of the film is shot handheld. This was before Steadicam, so as they say in the documentary, the DP needed to have very strong hands, and literally his focus puller was literally just round the front trying to get everything into focus by estimating the rough distance. But But that handheld gives it a really intense quality to it. There are some mounted camera shots, but the most of it is handheld. There's a wonderful scene where Mike tries to get into the club, and it's about 3 or 4 360s with just the camera going round and round. The score or the music is interesting. Some of it is by the German band Can, and some of it is by Cat Stevens, including a couple of songs. So it's an interesting score. It's one of those films, certainly from a fashion perspective, you could say, well, it's late 60s and 70s, but because of that odd quality it has, because of, like I said before, set in London but mostly shot in Germany, written by 2 Polish guys who English at the time wasn't their mother's tongue. Skolimoski is in it in a cameo, and obviously he would go on to be an actor. You'd probably recognise his face. He's been in an Avengers film, so he must be quality, obviously. But he makes a cameo, and he says in the documentary he's deliberately reading a Polish communist paper because he left Poland because of the regime. So he said that was just an in-joke for Polish audiences. The ending of the film is beautiful. It's poetic. Again, there's more bright colour. It's just a wonderful film. Again, yes, it's British, but it's not really British. It's a film about Britain, but it's one of those films that only an outsider could make, and it shows that an outsider made it. And like I said, because of the 15-year-old and like the schoolgirls involved, you probably couldn't make it now, or you'd have to make them slightly older. But it's just a wonderful film. I would highly recommend picking it up if you haven't already. It's a nice retrospective making of documentary. Jane Asher doesn't seem to have aged that much since about 1987, I think. So thanks very much for watching Deep End, not to be confused by The Deep End with Tilda Swinton, which I did a double take video on a while ago because that was a remake of Max Wolfell's Reckless Moment. This is just Deep End. Yeah, so please let me know in the comments if you've seen Deep End and what you think of it, and hopefully you'll join me again for more random reviews. This is Solitude Ronan from Solitude Ronan Films, saying farewell.